Well, good day, everybody, to this DDAX webinar. Today we are going to look at the RIN standard, the Recording Information Notification Standard, which is and was designed for use in the studio to capture data about creations as they were made. My name is Mark Isherwood, and along with my colleague here, Niels Bump, we will talk about the RIN standard. We are part of the Secretariat for DDAX. I will provide a short overview of DDAX. I'm sure most of you know what it is by now, but in case you don't, we will do a very short introduction. And then I'll go through some of the purposes of why the RIN standard was developed and created and now gradually being deployed. And then Niels will take a deeper dive into the way the RIN is constructed and walk you through the structure of the standard. Please do ask questions as we go along. We're very keen to provide as much understanding as possible. So if you have any questions, we will try and pick those up. If you could put those into the chat, we'll pick those up as we go along. So as you probably know, DDAX is a standards body, and we are focused primarily on the music value chain and how to most efficiently communicate data up and down that value chain amongst all the various different types of organizations that exist in the industry. We do this in three ways. What we're probably most known for is the development of message formats. This is basically a standard way of collecting data and transmitting it to your business partners, and it sets out the order in which data should be collected in a computer message relating to a particular business transaction, and how some of those data elements interact with each other in order to pass on information to business partners. We then also set down choreographies within some of these standards, and basically that is about what order the messages should be exchanged between two business partners for a particular type of business transaction, and we'll set down trigger points which determine that a message should be sent or received. And then finally, we set out the protocols by which the messages are actually exchanged. Most of that is done through secure FTP sites, but we are moving increasingly towards web services, certainly over the last 4 or 5 years, as the mechanism for exchanging messages in DDAX formats. Obviously, there is more detail to standardize within a web service exchange than there is within a secure FTP exchange. As I've mentioned, we have standards that relate to all of the roles that are played within the DDAX, within the music industry. So you can see here things like authors' rights societies, music publishers, record companies, distributors, and so on. And these are all types of companies that exist within the broader value chain and fulfill certain types of roles, certain types of activities within the value chain. And obviously, in so doing, all of those organizations will need to exchange data about musical works, about sound recordings and videos, but also about licenses relating to those works and recordings and claims in those works and recordings, and sales and usage information resulting from those licenses and claims. And so those the gray box in the bottom left hand corner shows you the different types of standards that we have, and through looking at the rail track color, you can see who is likely to be using that standard to exchange data. But where does all this data come from? And that's really the studio and the process of creating content. And without collecting data at this point, or at the several points in the creation of a sound recording, you can't get it into the value chain, into all the people that need to know it. And this has become increasingly a concern for the industry, particularly since the advent of digital. And this is where the RIN standard comes in, that it can be deployed as a standard to collect metadata within the studio so that it can be passed on in a standard form to all of the interested parties that need it in order to exchange it in the value chain, as in the previous slide. So RIN is part of a family of standards within DDAX, and DDAX is now increasingly ubiquitous. We have issued well in excess of 6,500 implementation licenses. That means 6,500 companies who are implementing the standard. DDAX itself doesn't have any detailed information about implementations, but we do obviously know that companies and certainly members of ours are exchanging data using DDAX standards, but we don't have specific information. But at least the ERN standard, the electronic release notification message, and the digital sales report are very, very widely deployed throughout the world. And then there are pockets of use of the other standards that we've developed. The result of that is that really, if you wish to be a serious player within the music industry these days, you are going to have to talk DDAX. You're going to have to be able to exchange messages using DDAX, and without that, you will struggle to be able to communicate information between your business partners. RIN is, however, one of those standards which is less widely deployed and implemented. And that has been part of the reason why there's been a lot of discussion within DDAX over the last year or so about whether the approach we originally took when launching RIN back in 2016 is the correct one. And Niels will talk about that later on. And lastly, in terms of DDAX itself, one last point is to draw your attention to the DDAX Dictionary, which defines the lingua franca of the music industry, as I've already hinted at. DDAX is sometimes referred to as a language, because the key thing that users of DDAX messages have to do is to translate their data model into DDAX and then send messages full of their data. And then effectively the recipient of the message has to translate out of DDAX into their own data model so that they can understand what is being communicated to them. So the data dictionary contains all of the semantics of all of the terms of all of the messages, the syntax of composites. Composites are sets of data that describe entities like sound recordings or parties, and have the data elements set out in a particular order with relationships between the different data elements within the composite to communicate information and describe, for example, a sound recording. And the key thing about these composites is that they become like building blocks within DDAX and are commonly used in that way throughout the standard. So obviously something like a sound recording or a musical work, which is important for almost every transaction, will use the basic composite that describes a sound recording or a musical work. So now turning more to the recording information notification standard. What RIN is really set out to do is to collect metadata, as much metadata as possible, about the contributors, the creations, the sound recordings, the equipment, the instruments that are used during the process of creation, and to do this at source at the time that the creation is being created. Because obviously without good metadata, much further down the value chain, consumers can't buy because they can't make decisions over what it is they want to stream or to download. And more importantly, all the contributors, musicians, engineers, and so on, won't get paid or credited for their involvement in the actual creation. So what RIN seeks to do is to describe a recording session. So it will set out information about when and where the recording session took place, who the contributors are, artists of all shapes and sizes, whether they're the main artist or just playing, third triangle or something of that nature. It will also detail the creator of the musical work, so the worker or writer of a musical work that may be being created in a studio. The instruments, as I mentioned, obviously need to be recorded. These can be very general, such as guitar, but can be specialized down to bass guitar or even the particular brand, if that's information that whoever is collecting the data feels is important. And then also the actual technical equipment that gets used in the process of creating the recording. And then the RIN describes the recording, what we call the recording components that are created as a result of a session. We've tried to use those words because they're neutral words. People have different interpretations of what stems and other colloquial words used in the studio mean, and so we went for these much more anonymous terminology. And then within the recording components, we describe all the different elements of those recording components and also point to the actual files, the audio files that have been created as a result of the session. So when we originally conceived the RIN back in 2016, the sort of cycle that we had envisaged is very much a sort of circular one, where there is a process, circular and or parallel. There's a process where creations are composed and recorded and mixed and mastered. Information about what happens at each of those events is collected, and the actual files is linked to the data. And this cycle goes on and on and on until it's ready to be passed on, usually and initially to a record company or a distributor. And it can also be passed on to other parties within the value chain, like collective rights organizations, music publishers, and so on. And we very much saw that as the way in which the process would unfold. As Niels will now explain, we've changed that view, and that has brought some changes with regard to the RIN standard. So I will now hand over control to Niels, and he will carry on with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. So yes, I think this process, broadly speaking, or at least the recording part of this process, still remains the same. You still have the composing, recording, mixing, the need to collect the information and doing it all over and over and over again until you have a final musical product. The handling of the metadata, however, has changed in some aspects. But first, some basis. As Marcus said, we're a standards organization. We create standards. RIN, the Recording Information Notification, is one of those standards, and it very heavily uses the synergy of the common tags that Mark has mentioned. So if you're describing a sound recording in the RIN message, it will be the same composite or a very similar composite that a record company would send to a DSP. So you would find exactly the same tags to describe title, to describe contributors, and so forth in both messages, as well as the radar message to the communication for to and with music licensing companies, for instance. This allows the data to seamlessly be deployed into the value chain, the commercial value chain, as well as along the different nodes and parties amongst them. And of course, we support all kinds of character sets and the like. Now, one of the things that Mark presented earlier is what can be collected in the standard or using the standard, what can be collected in applications and then sent message to other parties using the RIN standard. And what he presented there is very much the maximum view. I would suspect that in most cases, not all of the data points that RIN supports will actually be in a actual message. Users will be able to add as much and as little information as they want. Typically, you would want to include takes, mixing sessions, recording sessions, mastering sessions, all the input and outputs, and the people involved. So if you want to know that Elton John played piano on He Ain't Heavy by the Hollies, for example, that information, well, this particular piece of information is fairly widely known because both the Hollies and Elton John are fairly famous musicians. But that is not the case for all of those contributions of musicians. And wouldn't you want to know in 30 years that you played a specific piece of music on a specific record? Well, you can only do that if that information is provided. So while RIN doesn't force you to provide all of that information, I personally would encourage people to provide as much information as possible, knowing very well that people are in the studio to record music or to write music, not to enter metadata, but there you go. Now, what's in RIN? Let me give you a whistle-stop tour, and it will be comparatively short and sweet, even though the message is actually quite large and rich. Mark has already said we have a version out there which has been implemented, not widely, but we do have some real-world implementation experiences. The current version that has been published is version 1.1, which is just a very minor update to version 1.0. And we are in the process of publishing version 2.0. We're going through the last bit of editing within the relevant working group within DDAX, but I would certainly expect this to be published during the course of this year, in all likelihood before the summer even. Now, the message structure is virtually the same as in version 1.1, which begs the question, why do we call it 2.0 and not 1.2? And indeed, we had that discussion. We came to the conclusion that because of the different way of exchanging the message, Marcus hinted at that, it is actually a significantly different beast, even though the structure is virtually the same. So when I updated these slides, we have on our website a webinar for the original RIN message, if you like. I noticed that at least on this high level, there is virtually no change to it, yet these diagrams are all from the draft of version 2.0. So what do we have there? Well, oops, sorry. So this is the message, and it starts with, well, one of the biggest changes actually. We've replaced the file header that RIN 1.0 and 1.1 had with the message header that all other DDAX standards have as well. ERN has it, all the radar messages have it, all the musical works licensing messages, they all have virtually the same message header. So you provide who sent the message, to whom, when it was created, all of those kind of housekeeping issues. The slight difference here is that while most DDAX messages are being sent by commercial company to commercial company, and it's the commercial companies that send the message, for example, a record company who sends a message to a DSP, an ERN message in that case, it's those companies who are also responsible for the data. This is slightly different here. As we will see, these services that send the messages will actually be cloud services that store the information on behalf of actual users. So you now have two people actually involved in sending the message, who created the message itself and who created the data in there. So we need to differentiate those two. That's why we also need to include the RIN processor name and version, which would be version, well, yeah, it's a specific application. I don't need to name any. And then you have also a link to previous messages. Why that is important, I'll come to in a moment as well. You then have a description of parties, and a party is anybody or any organization that has anything to do with that recording process or writing process, that creation process. And this is how we describe a party. There's nothing really surprising about it. Party ID, you can give a party name, you can provide affiliation. So if a writer is affiliated with a music publisher, or a recording artist is affiliated with a record company or a collective rights management organization. You can relate parties. So if there are 3 people in the studio who are recording and they're all members of the same band, you can then have actually 4 parties there, the band and the 4 musicians, and relate them to each other. You can then provide gender, territory of residency, and so forth, which is all important, or may be important to people down the value chain, to actually make sure that people get paid the appropriate amount and get the rights they deserve based on local laws and so forth. And you see all the other tags that you have there. The next bunch of composites, rather large lists of items, describe the stuff, the musical works, the resources, and the recording components, which some people call stems, but we couldn't really completely agree what a stem is. There were different views in the room, therefore we opted for a fairly vanilla term there. Musical works, that's the composition, that's the lyrics and so forth. Resources, those are the sound recordings. Looking at the musical work itself, again, it's a fairly simple composite in this case. You have an identifier, you have a title, you have potentially alternative titles, which can be translations, but it can also be first line of text and those kind of things that if you want to provide that, you can. When was it created? You can provide the lyrics if you want to. There's a comment, and you can provide contributors, who are the writers and or publishers to that musical work. You will note that there are no right shares or any of that kind in here. That's not what this message is meant to provide. It provides just who is part of the work creation. The same applies more or less to the resources, but I'll focus here on the recording component, the stem for you and me. So again, you have an identifier, which will typically be a proprietary identifier because there is no standard identifier for recording components or stems. The sequence number, well, take 15, title. You can provide a version title, whether it's a live version or whether it's a studio version, whether it's an a cappella version or whatever you may have. Again, contributors, very important. Recording component equipment reference, which points then to the recording components, the equipment that has been used to record that. not the instruments. That's part of the contributor composite, where you can then say, well, BB King played Lucille or whatever it may have been. Again, creation date, which language it has been, and whether the whole thing is a medley or not. And you will also notice by the thin lines that there is very little mandatory fields there. The only thing that you have to have is a recording component reference, but that's an internal identifier within the message itself. So that's actually not data that you would find outside of the RIN message. You need a sequence number, you need to have a title, and you need to have a display artist name. The artist for whom the whole thing is destined to become a sound recording. Whether that then will be the display artist name on the sound recording, that's a different matter. But at the moment of creating this stuff, that's the artist that people think this is a recording for. All the other things are optional, very valuable for the musicians, for the consumers, and for the companies in the value chain, but they are optional. The next bunch of fields deals with recording projects. That's basically the administrative unit at the commissioning label. When, especially for larger record companies, they commission some kind of musical project, they assign a number to it so that they have the ability to account for it. That's basically a recording project, everything that happens underneath that. Session, well, that's an event in the studio. I'll show you how that looks in a moment. And then equipment is all the instruments and recording devices used. That has to some extent changed between version 1.1 and 2.0, because we have in the current version named instrument. We have a list of instruments types, guitar, and amongst them is, for example, Gibson guitar. We've noticed that that's actually nonsensical. We still allow to communicate brand names, but not as part of the allowed value set, because there are just too many of them. That doesn't really make much sense. So how does the session look? It's a little bit more complex, so I had to cut the little thingy there in two. And again, virtually everything is optional. Only a session reference, that's internal identifier, and the session type. Is it a writing session? Is it a recording session? Is it a mixing session? Is it a mastering session? That's the only thing that needs to be provided. Everything else, when did it start the session? When did the session end? Time and or date. Where, in which venue did that happen? Then there are some flags that are important in specific jurisdictions for rights management purposes, whether it's a union session, whether it's an analog session is something important, what bit depth was used, what sampling rate was used, assuming that it's digital and so forth. But you see all those fields there. And at the end, you see, well, as part of which project was this session run, what was used as equipment in that session, and then the last one is where is it actually being stored, what's the sound recording that came out of that session, and what are all those stems that were being created during that session. So that gives you basically the big handle on what happened in the studio. And then at the tail end, we get to the data carriers, elements, and files. That's basically how is the audio, the music, actually stored. I'm not going to go into any detail there. And then the transfers. Sometimes music is simply transferred without any further input from the creative side, from one system to another system. That needs to be documented and can be documented during the transfer list down here, and then the imported RIN files, which kind of allows daisy chaining RIN files. And that was important in the original vision of RIN, where you had one RIN file that grew and grew and grew and grew, and all the older bits, from the earlier sessions, those were all demoted, if you like, into this imported RIN files section of the file. In 2.0, this is far less important. We still support it for backwards compatibility reasons, and there may be points where, for archival, where somebody may actually want to create, once all is done and dusted, a product has been released, and you want to put the music into the vault so that it's stored there for posterity, and you want to create one RIN file that contains all the other RIN files that contributed to it. And that's where you can do that. But for the normal process of collecting the information and providing it into the value chain, the imported RIN files is kind of less important in version 2.0 and going forward. So let me just highlight this change that we've done. In version 1, we have RIN files accompanying audio files. These RIN files get enriched en route and are to be sent to a label when all is done and dusted. That's this diagram. And when all is done and dusted at the end, the information then flows to into the supply and value chain. In version 2, or while we're discussing where RIN should go to, we realized that record companies actually need the information much earlier. If they get it only once everything is done, it's basically too late to check all the information, to start compiling label copy information, and to potentially get licenses in place to actually meet any kind of reasonable timetable for publication of the music. So this doesn't really work. It may very well work for small independent musicians who work in their bedroom, maybe 5 people, one in here in London, somebody in LA, somebody in Bangkok. They work together. This may very well work, but we need to make sure that RIN works for small musicians as well as musicians signed to major record companies. But where even for smaller musicians this actually starts to break down is when we realize that those RIN processes are actually cloud services. We originally envisaged that you had a mixing desk, well, that's a big table in a recording studio, or a laptop on a bedroom floor, that you have the music on there and that you have all the metadata stored on there. But that's not the case. RIN processes are cloud services. All of the ones that we have seen that have implemented RIN are cloud services. So the process now looks, you still have this circular kind of enriching, and the music gets better, and more mixes and more stems and more stuff is being added. That still goes on. It's much more chaotic, obviously, than a clean circular motion. But this collection of the metadata actually happens in the cloud. And whenever there is a specific point in time, whether it's once a month, whether it's once a session is over, there may need to be information being sent off to the record company. So all of those information that in the end will be sent to the record company, who enriches the data, to checks the data, who gets the licenses. It will then be able to hit the market via labels and distributors, as in RIN 1.0. But it's now a message that the RIN processor service can just fire off whenever there is the need for it. And of course, you need to have the ability to exchange the information between different services. So if you have one musician's using one RIN cloud collection data service and one musician uses a separate system, you need to be able to exchange those RIN messages between those systems. So it's a different conceptual approach here. It used to be a file format, or still is a file format, where the RIN file would gather increasingly rich metadata describing the process and then travel with the sound files from studio to studio and ultimately to the record company. And we're now saying, based on existing implementations, based on the fact that data is usually held in the cloud, that people will allow the communication of snapshots of metadata at specific points in time, and then it's the recipient's job to collect and to check and to put the ultimate set of data, the definite metadata set about a specific product, a specific sound recording, a specific work, a specific release together, based on this trickle of RIN messages rather than a big dump at a specific time. For that, we have different message exchange mechanisms, and as usual, the music industry still thrives off FTP. So RIN can be used, can be sent using FTP manifests, and acknowledgements have been therefore added to the RIN standard itself, and they're basically the same as in all the other messaging standards. But we also have a web service which is asymmetric, where the recipient to publish a, that's actually wrong what's written there, where the recipient of the RIN message publishes a web service and the sender simply calls the recipient's web service and saying, here is another message that I have. So it's a record companies typically that would publish a web service, and the RIN processors would simply send this stuff to them. But also the RIN processors would need to have an interface for other RIN services to upload their RIN files, their RIN messages to that service to allow this cross-fertilization between different musicians. And I want to finish basically by saying that there is actually never too much data in the supply chain. There is the Recording Academy Give Credit program, which is good. It's not searchable, not scalable at the moment, but if you start collecting, or if musicians start to collect information and you then use RIN to share that information amongst the musicians who collaborate on a specific project and then into the supply and value chain, at that stage, the data becomes searchable, actionable, and as Marcus has said, credits will be delivered, money will be delivered, and consumers will actually be able to receive the content that they want. That's all we had. There's actually one thing that I wanted to add as well that was not formally agreed within RIN 1, but that is now part of RIN 2, and that is the level of granularity. In RIN 2.0, what we have agreed is that everything will be about, or a single RIN message will be about one sound recording that is ultimately meant to be delivered to consumers. So you would have a sound recording, all the sessions that contribute to that sound recording, or the projects on which that sound recording is in there, and all the stems, all the recording components that are to contribute to that sound recording will be in one message. If you're talking about a second sound recording, that will be a second RIN message. Now, obviously, things may change, and a stem that was for one recording now goes into another recording. So it's not that clear cut that things will always stay together. But the principal idea is, here is a sound recording with all its metadata bits and bobs together. And now the record company can go away and start assembling the information needed, or any other company that needs and wants that information. That's RIN in a nutshell. As Mark said at the beginning, if there are any questions, we're more than happy to answer them either now or later via email.
As there's so few of you on, if you want to ask a question, just open your mic. I think we can manage that with the limited number of people we have here.
Yeah, it's Jörg asking you. Is there, if you record a big orchestra, have you provided a place for the contractor? Because you always need a contractor to get all those many people together. Have you provided this place in your files?
They from the structure of the
do you consider contract as a contributor, I guess? But
correct.
Yeah, okay, that's my question.
No,
Yeah.
they would be a contributor. So we see a contributor as anyone who contributes to the creation of the stuff. That is certainly the main artist who sings and has the microphone in front of his mouth, as well as all the musicians, as well as all the engineers, as well as all the people behind the microphone, if they're considered to having contributed something. So if you want to add the tea lady to the list of contributors because she added good vibes to it, there you go. You would add her in. Now,
Okay.
do we have an appropriate allowed value for an organizer of the orchestra or contractor, or however you call that? I cannot recall that at the moment. I can check that offline. But in principle, you're absolutely right. That would be a contributor.
Because similar situation would be if you hire a very famous musician. Normally, you go through the agent of him, the manager. So this manager or agent will always also be provided in this list.
Can be provided. If
Okay.
people think that that's appropriate, it certainly can. Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Chloe, you opened your mic.
Yeah, I just wanted to double check what you said. You mentioned that the RIN file would ideally just be for a single recording. Is that right?
Yes.
And so there would be no use of creating a RIN for an entire release per se. An album, sorry.
No, you would have multiple RIN files for that. So what typically happens, or what quite often happens, I guess I don't need to tell you what typically happens, but the process and the relationship between the different entities that we see as most conductive for actually providing the right information is you'd have a recording project that the record company sets up for the delivery of, let's say, 10 deliverables, 10 sound recordings. Each of, and then you would have 10 broadcast wave files, I guess, in the end being delivered to the record company. That's what the artist is contractually obliged to do. And you would have 10 different RIN messages going along with it. They all would reference the same recording project because that's where basically the financial impetus came from. But they are individual recordings. I don't think you would even mention the release in the RIN. That is something that happens at a later stage at the record company who then puts that together. One thing I should immediately myself by saying I said there would be 10 RIN message. That's of course not entirely true. There will be, if you like, 10 series of RIN messages, because for each of the sound recordings you will in all likelihood have multiple ones whenever it's being initially recorded and then it's being mixed and then it's being mastered. At each stage you would get a RIN message, but one for each of the recordings. Does that make sense? Or
Yeah, it does. Thank you.